Well, a short time ago, I spoke with financial commentator Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz about the KiwiSaver plans. I asked him what sort of message this is likely to send to those in the scheme or looking at joining it.
People who are already in KiwiSaver will be disappointed because they joined up with the scheme on the condition they thought the government would continue to give them $20 a week. Now, it looks like at least some of that will be pulled back by the government. However, they've still got the $1,000 kickstart, so that money isn't being taken away. And in theory, the government's going to leave some sort of kicker in there, some sort of maybe $5 a week, $10 a week, we don't know yet. But there's something in there for people who are in KiwiSaver, but not as much as they were getting before.
John Key's saying he expects either individuals or employers to make up the balance, whatever that balance happens to be. Obviously, some of that's going to depend on how big the gap becomes, but realistically, are people going to do that or not?
Well, the whole thing about KiwiSaver is that it's voluntary above that 2% level. And this was the issue here. You got the government matching contribution, and that was the incentive for deciding to increase your contribution up to a certain level. Now, if the government's saying we're not going to give you that matching contribution, why would you increase your saving? And the idea that somehow the government or an employer is going to ask you nicely to increase your saving, there doesn't seem to be a reason to increase that saving unless the incentive's there. And this is one of the problems. The more the government tweaks and fiddles with this scheme, the less confidence people have that it will be there in 20, 30 years' time when they want it to be there.
That's the key word, confidence. It's taken a while for people to get confidence. They gradually are, obviously, looking at the numbers. But now you've got the government going, oh, hang on, we're going to tweak it. We're not going to give you as much. That's just going to shatter confidence of people who are on it and people who are going to go on it, isn't it? It's a pension scheme. It's supposed to be dependable.
We should remember that KiwiSaver has been extraordinarily successful. 1.7 million people have joined the scheme. That's a very high take-up rate. And $8 billion is now in this scheme. It's a serious player. And there is a danger here that if the government mucks around with it too much, people will say, this is another one of these pension schemes that the government comes up with every few years. It gets voted in, it gets voted out. We can't rely on it. We'll go back to putting our money into 2, 3-bedroom brick and tile rental properties, exactly what the government doesn't want. So the government's treading along a fine line here. Too many changes too often, people lose confidence in it.
Was there, though, an inevitability that they had to do this with the books looking like they look? This was the place they had to pull the belt in a bit.
There are lots of choices for the government to cut spending, and effectively they've decided to cut spending on a savings program. Now, the government's right when it says that it doesn't make any sense to borrow from foreign investors, give it into fund management schemes here in New Zealand, who then promptly will invest a lot of it overseas. So you've got a merry-go-round of money here with various financial intermediaries clipping the ticket, and effectively it doesn't make sense. It's a bit like, as the government said, you go and borrow money from ANZ and you put it into Westpac. Well, at the end of the day, you're no better off. The problem here is, though, the government could have cut spending in other ways to increase national savings. And many people are arguing you should be cutting spending on consumption. You shouldn't be cutting spending on investment. And that effectively is what the government has done here.
In theory, they're saying they're hoping the people will make up, individuals will make up the difference. A lot of people, that's just not going to be an option. They would have set aside how much they can put into it, and that will be it, won't it?
Yes, we're already putting aside a lot of money into savings, a lot of money to tax, extra spending on petrol and food. The idea that we've got yet more money to pump into saving is going to be difficult for many people. Certainly after the tax cuts last year and the increased GST, many people are feeling stretched. And for the government to say, well, we're not going to put the money in, we want you to put it in now, and we're not going to give you an incentive, that's not going to be credible for many people. And this is why I think it's dangerous for the government to mess with KiwiSaver too much. You get to a threshold where people say, hey, you've mucked me around too much, I'm just not going to be part of it anymore.
Other than you'll end up living in a cardboard box and eating cat food, what incentive is there for people to pull up the slack themselves and go, all right, they're not going to sort of come to the party as much as they were, I will? What incentive is there? What incentive does there need to be?
Well, there is some incentive. There's the kickstart, and you'd think the government leaves some sort of a matching tax credit there. The other issue, and this is part of the problem with the New Zealand savings system, we have quite a good national superannuation scheme, and the government and the Prime Minister himself have said, I'm not going to raise the retirement age, and I'm not going to change the 66% payment of the average wage to people who are on the national superannuation scheme. And for some people, they say, well, why should I save when I'm going to get national super anyway? And that's one of the issues that we have in New Zealand, that the super scheme is so good that many people don't bother to save. Of course, it's not enough to live in the way in which you've become accustomed, but at some stage, New Zealanders generally will have to save a lot more for their retirement, because there is a risk that we may not be able to afford New Zealand super come 10, 20 years' time when the baby boomers retire.
Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz.